So I'm going to close my mouth and let him speak.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Hey, I'm very grateful that all of you came here tonight. I hope you haven't made a dreadful mistake, but I'll try to give a very interesting talk, not only about how the Civil War Balloon Corps has ties to today's Air Force and Navy, but to this town of Poolesville as well, as some of you probably already know. And there are going to be some unique features of this presentation, I hope, one of which is sort of an optical one that will happen at the end. If I forget to do that, please remind me. And the other one is a shameless promotion of my new book that's been published by the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's called Hooves, Paws, and Claws for the Cause, Animals in the Civil War. And it also talks about the Balloon Corps in this book. So anyway, I just happened to have brought some copies, signed copies of me. They're not signed by me because I don't know how to write my name. No, just kidding. But if you're interested, at the end of the program, I have them for sale. So without any further ado, let's begin the program. So if we could start with the first slide, please. And we're going to talk about, the Air Force. And one of the questions is, well, are balloons really aircraft? And the answer is absolutely they are. And in terms of the word aircraft, it was in use as early as 1845 when there were only balloons around. So when we talk about the origin of an Air Force, it really does go back to this period of time. So to give some background, next slide, please. The backstory, well, the beginning of manned flight begins with the Mongolia brothers in France, and in 1784, they lift off in Paris in a hot air balloon, and they float to an altitude of about 500 feet and travel about 5.5 miles before they land safely. Now, to show you how quick progress can develop, it's not long thereafter, indeed just 10 days later, that the first gas balloon comes into use, and it's full of hydrogen, and it's launched by physicists Jacques Alexander Charles and Nicolas Louis Robert. And that flight also starts in Paris, but that lasts for 2.5 hours and covered a distance of 25 miles. Now, how about the United States? Well, the first manned flight in the United States will be about 10 years later in 1793. It's also a hydrogen gas balloon, and it's piloted by an American scientist, John Jeffries, but also a French officer, Jean-Pierre Blanchard. George Washington is in attendance to see this flight, and it was launched from Philadelphia. It attained an altitude of a rather astounding 5,800 feet and traveled from Philadelphia Prison Yard to an area outside New Jersey shoreline. So a year before, Blanchard had been the first man to ever cross the English Channel in a balloon. So you have a new invention, we being people, have to figure out a way to use it to kill other people. So was it used in aerial combat between people of different ideologies or nationalities to further a cause? Heck no, it was used over a woman. So, and not just any woman, apparently a rather fantastic woman by the name of Mademoiselle Théroitte. And she was the mistress of Monsieur de Grandpierre, but she was also seeing Monsieur Lepic. Well, that wasn't gonna stand well with either man, so they challenged each other. And according to this English account that we see up here, and it's a very joking account, they took an elevated attitude toward the situation. And what they did is, one of the problems is when you challenge somebody in a duel with pistols, the outcome was very often that you would miss each other and neither person would be killed, and you'd have to do it all over again, or you'd have to forgive about the feud. Well, these guys are so intense and so determined to kill one another that here's what they decide to do. They're going to go up in 2 balloons. Each of them is going to have a blunderbuss, which is kind of like a shotgun, okay? And then once they reach a certain altitude, they're going to be about 80 feet away from each other, and when the signal happens, then bingo. So unfortunately, Mr. Lepic is the first one to shoot. He's quick on the draw, but he's not so good at aiming, and somehow, some way, he misses the balloon, and the other guy shoots him, and it's not good for him or for his second, because unlike a normal duel, when the second gets to safely, stand by the side and not get shot at, if you're in balloon with the guy you're seconding, you get smashed to pieces when you land too, or crash. So this is the first example of aerial combat. But how about military? How about military use? Well, it's used a little bit. Balloons are used for observational purposes during the Napoleonic Wars, but not that much. However, Napoleon actually is a very far-sighted guy, and he proposes to his expert, who is a woman, by the way, the aeronaut official of festivals, Sophie Blanchard, who is the widow of the other Blanchard I just mentioned, who crossed the English Channel. Unfortunately, he dies in a balloon accident. Unfortunately for her, later she will die in a balloon accident. But at the time, she's the prevailing expert on balloons. So he says, can we invade England? And she told him, nah, probably not a good idea because of, the wind over the channel and stuff like that. But anyway, ultimately, there is a trial of using air power to get a military objective, and the Austrians use it when they besiege the city of Venice. And they do that in 1849, and they develop these paper bags, balloons, that can carry, bombs that weigh 24 to 30 pounds. They have a fuse in them, and the idea is you float them across, and at some point the fuse will go off, and kaboom, it will land and cause devastation on Venice. Well, they launch about 200 of these, and they're not that effective, and one of the reasons is the wind tends to blow them around. They actually, for the first time, also launched them from a ship. That's kind of a new innovation, and here's an Austrian ship called the Volcano, which launches them. So at least one of the bombs does hit their target in Venice, but the rest of them just kind of go around with the breeze, and not so great for the Austrians, including the people aboard the ship. They tend to blow back toward the Austrian line, so kind of a thing. So, balloons are used a bit in the Crimean War, which is in the 1850s, shortly before the Civil War. Again, mainly for observation, but not really in a consistent or that useful way. So we're going to focus on the Civil War, where they are used for the first time in a consistent and effective way. And the backstory on that is with some of the leaders in ballooning going into the Civil War. And of course, one of them is Thaddeus Lowe, who you may have heard of. He is not really well educated, but he's a brilliant guy. He's sort of self-taught, and he masters a number of skills. And he is very influenced by one of the original great balloonists in the United States, John Wise. And Lowe is able, based on his writings, to build for himself and pilot his first balloon in 1857. And he'll continually build larger and larger balloons. And his real desire is to build one that can go across the Atlantic. And indeed, he builds one ultimately that's 103 feet in diameter and has a lifting capacity of 11.5 tons and can carry an 8-man crew and even can carry a gondola beneath it, or a lifeboat beneath the gondola. He initially calls it the City of New York, but he calls it the Great Western because there's a magnificent ship the English have built called the Great Eastern. So this is his plan. And he launches a test flight in 1860 from New Jersey, but unfortunately it suffers wind damage and it's short lasting. So he tries again. And in April of 1861, Low attempted another one from Cincinnati, Ohio. It's kind of a test flight. And it makes a lot of progress, but unfortunately it drifts all the way into the ironically named Unionville, South Carolina. Unionville is part of South Carolina, which has just seceded from the Union. So a Yankee lands in a big balloon, and of course they think he's a spy. So it takes a while for him to convince them that no, he's just, a scientist. And he eventually makes his way back to, the Union. And immediately he's summoned by, Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, who wants to enlist his services for the Union. Now, interesting fact about Thaddeus Lowe, for those who've seen The Right Stuff, you may remember the character of Poncho Barnes. She's a woman that owns a bar near Edwards Air Force Base. She was one of the early aviatrixes. All the astronauts and test pilots knew her. She was his granddaughter. Now, Lowe wasn't the only one that wanted to head up a Union Balloon Corps. One of his big rivals was John Lamontagne. Lamontagne had been a seaman. Again, not a lot of formal education, but a really bright guy. He really picked up on things. And he actually collaborated and was mentored by John Wise, who I mentioned earlier. And in 1852, the two of them tried a attempted flight across the continent. And their balloon, the Atlantic, ascended on July 1st from St. Louis, and several guests were on board. And it was an impressive flight. I mean, it lasted 20 hours and covered 1,150 miles. And as a crow flies, it would have been about 800 some miles. Unfortunately, it crashed, and with that crash, that ended their partnership. But Lamontagne decided to continue on, and in September of 1859, he made another ascension on the Atlantic from Watertown, New York, accompanied by a newspaper man by the name of John Haddock, and their flight crossed sections of Minnesota, Michigan, and then went into Canada. And ultimately, it landed, but they didn't have any provisions, and they were stranded for days until rescued by some lumberjacks that found them. Despite these setbacks, though, Lamontagne was regarded as one of the top balloonists of the time, and he also sought to be part of the Union Balloon Corps. So, these guys, along with others, are desperate to volunteer their skills in ballooning to help the Union cause. Now, the thing is, the advantage that Lowe has is he has connections and he has some showmanship. So, among other things, he has the support of Secretary Chase and the president of the Smithsonian, guy by the name of Joseph Henry. So they tell him to come to Washington, D.C. and put on a demonstration. And boy, does he. He brings his balloon to the actual National Mall. It's the Enterprise, and he lifts up in the Enterprise 500 feet in the air, taller than anything around him, because even at that point, the Washington Monument isn't fully constructed. So there he is, higher than anything in Washington, D.C. And he has the foresight to do something that no one else had ever done. He takes a telegraph set with him on the balloon, and the cable to the telegraph is connected to the tether that keeps him, on the National Mall. And it goes all the way to the War Department. And so what he is able to do for the first time in history, in real time, is to tell people what he is seeing from 500 feet above Washington. Lincoln is amazed by it. So once that is done, amazingly enough, they land the Enterprise, and even with the balloon still full, they're able to march it all the way up from the mall to the White House so that Lincoln can inspect it himself. They have a long conversation with each other, Lincoln and Low, and Lincoln, sort of against the Army's wishes, tells the Army that there is to be a Union Balloon Corps and that Low is the man that will be the chief aeronaut for it. And that's the term that they use, aeronaut. So, where is this to be centered? Well, it ends up being centered in good old Poolesville. Yeah. So, the Union Balloon Corps consists of a squadron of 7 balloons, 3 small one-man low-altitude balloons and 4 larger balloons and high altitude. And you can see here, this is pretty significant stuff. These were made to specification. They were constructed to be sturdier and more weather resistant than pre-war civilian balloons. Double layers of silk were coated with 4 coats of varnish to enhance their durability. Communication options, were a number of things. Telegraph, as I just mentioned, signal flags, weighted messages, and other colored aerial flares. And they had the capacity to go 5,000 feet in the air. And again, Poolesville was really the center of the United States Air Force at the time. Yeah. So wear that with pride. Okay, so Low is not satisfied with his balloon corps, though, because it's okay that he's able to ascend in Washington, D.C. using coal gas, which is kind of like hydrogen, but he realizes the war is going to go far beyond Washington. Just standing around in Washington or being aloft in Washington only gives you so much utility to the Army. You have to go where the fighting is. So what he does is he develops an ingenious system to make his Union Balloon Corps more mobile, and he develops portable generators for creating hydrogen gas. And what he does is he works with the U.S. Navy Yard, and they build these carriages or these wagons that contain these large tanks filled with dilute sulfuric acid and iron filings that can generate the hydrogen gas and move these balloons to where they're needed in battlefields like at Manassas or even further out. So again, he's continually advancing and improving the technology. And that leads to the birth of the first aircraft carrier, the USN George Washington Parke Custis. So even with these wagons, they're an advancement, don't get me wrong, but they're very heavy. They require a lot of horses. They have to be driven over tough roads. Why not take advantage of the speed of watercraft? There are many waterways in which battles are being taken place next to. Control of the water is very important. So why not place some of these generators aboard ships and launch your balloons off of ships? So again, Low has excellent relationships with the Navy, at times better than with the Army. The Army, you'll sort of see a theme here that many Army commanders sort of resent the Balloon Corps. They're never formally incorporated into the Army. Yet the Navy, in many senses, sees the utility, the promise of the Balloon Corps. So he will work with John Dahlgren, who will later become a rear admiral, and they develop these ships. And what they do is to develop this, what we would today call an aircraft carrier. They buy a coal barge that was built in the 1850s, and they transform it into a carrier at the Navy Yard in August of 1861. And here are the specifications for it. Fairly big ship, 120 feet. It's got a beam of 14 feet. And by the way, it's a barge, so it's not powered. It can't propel itself in the water. So it's teamed up with a ship called the USN Coeur de Lion, and it has a displacement of 110 tons. It's about the same length, but it's also armed, so it can defend the aircraft carrier. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the ironic thing in this is the Navy's notoriously cheap, so whenever they acquire a ship, they don't change the name of it. So the name of this ship is the George Washington Parke Custis, which is okay because he's the stepson of George Washington. So that would be good. That would be a positive. A little bit of a negative. He's also the father-in-law of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. So it's a little awkward, but hey, you know, the Navy isn't going to spend good money changing the name. Okay. So while, you know, Lowe is doing this and making all these innovations, LaMontagne is getting a sponsorship from a Union general by the name of Benjamin Butler. He's in command of Fortress Monroe in southeastern Virginia. And the summer of 1861, LaMontagne, under the permission of Butler, begins a series of surveillance flights for his army on Confederate position. Now, he takes an entirely different approach than Lowe does. All of Lowe's flights are tethered. That means that there is a rope that keeps them on the ground. They're not going to wander off. You know, a breeze is not going to take them across into enemy lines. LaMontagne is, he wants to go commando. He doesn't want to be tethered. He wants to go with the wind because he thinks being tethered inhibits, you know, your ability to really get a good view of what's going on in the enemy lines. So bravely, or some might say full-heartedly, he does do all of his flights untethered, and sometimes it could lead him into danger and jeopardy. There are a couple of close calls, but despite that, he is never shot down, he is never captured. Now, one of the big questions, and it can be somewhat controversial because there may be some Army and Navy vets here or people, is who had the first aircraft carrier? Well, you would think it was the one I just mentioned, but some people contend no, they were beaten to the punch by LaMontagne. LaMontagne hears about what Lowe is doing, and he likes to do Lowe one better, so he decides, you know what, I'm going to launch one of my balloons, and he launches it from a ship called the Fanny, which is a small propeller-driven steam tug that's operated by the U.S. Army Corps. The launch occurred on the James River near Sewell Point, Virginia, and it allowed LaMontagne to ascend to 2,000 feet and observe the Confederate defenses at Norfolk. So you could say, aha, the first aircraft carrier was actually an Army ship. Well, I think I can feel the bristles going up on every Navy vet's thing. And I have no skin in the game. I was in neither service, but I would maintain there are a number of reasons why the Fanny cannot be considered the first aircraft carrier. First of all, it was not built or structurally altered to be an aircraft carrier. It was just there at the time. Calling it the first aircraft carrier would be like saying that the USS Birmingham was the first aircraft carrier just because the first powered flight took off from its bow. Yeah, that's true, but it couldn't land back on the ship, and the ship wasn't designed to be an aircraft carrier, so no one would consider the Birmingham an aircraft carrier. The Fanny lacked basic equipment and capacity to sustain flight operations, but my most important argument in all this is that nothing named Fanny should have any historical distinction. So let's say what the truth is, that the America's first and the world's first aircraft carrier, oh, next slide please, I'm sorry, was the George Washington Parke Custis. It and the Coeur de Lion make it out to the Potomac River, and on the morning of November 11th, accompanied by Union General Dan Sickles, who's quite a character during the Civil War, Low goes up from the deck, and it's the first aircraft carrier launch, and he's able to observe Confederate forces on the Virginia shore 3 miles away. Following this successful flight, he will say, "We had a fine view of the enemy campfires during the evening and saw the rebels constructing battery at Freestone Point," and thus the aircraft carrier age was born. Next slide, please. So these are going to be used in a major way. Both the balloons and these carrier forces are used in a major way during the Peninsula Campaign. This is a big effort by General George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac to attack Richmond, Virginia, via the peninsula and go up the James River. And throughout that, he's depending quite a bit on Low and these naval vessels. Indeed, you could say that the first carrier battle group is developed during this campaign. All these ships that you see at the bottom were used to either launch or escort Low's balloon corps. And they achieved some significant objectives here. For example, at one point, Low was able to be towed down the James River for 13 miles at an altitude of 1,000 feet, making Low able to get a continuous view of enemy forces and report what he was seeing in real time to people below. So this is a real, benchmark in aviation history. Next slide, please. So this is all occurring on the East Coast. What about the West Coast? Well, there are some balloon enthusiasts on the West Coast as well who have made some notable achievements. One of the other big balloon advocates going into the Civil War is a very accomplished aeronaut by the name of John Steiner, and he's sent by Low to see if the balloon corps can be helped in the Western theater. And once again, it's kind of an interesting reaction. One of the big battles that's occurring at the time Steiner goes out there is the battle over Island Number 10. It is a strategically held small island. It's held by the Confederacy on the Mississippi River. Confederate control of that is impeding Union efforts to invade the deep interior of the Confederacy. And the Union Army and Navy had developed a plan to envelop the Confederate force on the island and eventually besiege it until they submit. But one of the problems is they can't quite figure out where to concentrate their fire, how to best decimate Confederate forces. So Steiner approaches the Army once he gets to Cairo, Illinois, and he offers his services to the Army. And again, this theme comes up where the Army says basically thanks, but no thanks. It's the Navy commander, Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, later Rear Admiral Foote, who will say, yes, we could use your help. Let me give you a ship. Let's take advantage of this. And so Steiner, borrows from Low's, game plan and starts launching his ship. And he is able, after a few attempts, to get a good view of what the enemy fortifications are like on island number 10. And again, for the first time in history, he is able to direct naval gunfire on those targets he's seeing aboard the island. So this is something, again, revolutionary. For the first time, the Navy effectively has eyes on the targets they're shooting at. Next slide, please. Now, how about the South? What are they doing about this? What about the Confederacy? Are they going to let the Union have a balloon corps and not have their own? No siree. They're going to launch theirs. The problem is they don't have the expertise nor the materials that the Union does. The Union has a far bigger, industrial base than the South does, far more materials. And let's not forget the Union blockade is occurring at this time. The U.S. Navy is blockading ports, so the Confederacy has trouble getting raw materials like silk and that kind of stuff. So despite that, though, the Confederacy, rather, is going to try to launch their own Air Corps. Unfortunately for them, again, they don't have any trained aeronauts. So the first guy they pick to do it is an Army captain, a rather courageous fellow named Captain John R. Bryan. And when he's tapped for this duty, he is quoted as saying, "I have never even seen a balloon, and I know absolutely nothing about the management of it." So, despite that fact, he gamely goes up in one. It is not a silk balloon. Instead, it is a balloon that is powered by hot gas. And it comes from burning turpentine-soaked pine cones. What could go wrong there? So he made his first descent in April of 1862 over Yorktown, VA. And indeed, he was able to observe Union forces and make sketches of them. However, his second flight was a near disaster because as he goes up, one of the crew that is helping the ascent gets tangled up in the tether, and they have to cut the tether, which means he's now floating with no control over it. He flies over Confederate lines, so you'd think, oh, that's no problem, except the Confederate troops below think he's actually a Union balloon because they've never seen a Confederate one, so they start shooting at him. And unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he's finally able to sort of crash to the ground, and he escapes any injury, but that's his last mission, and understandably why. So the next attempt is another balloon. This one, more likely to succeed. It's called the Gazelle, and it's privately funded by a guy by the name of Langdon Cheves in Savannah, Georgia. It's made of silk, but it's made of segments of silk material that was going to be used for dresses. Now, ultimately, there came to be a wives' tale that was made out of silk gowns or something. It wasn't, but it was made out of material that was meant to be made into silk gowns. So the guy who's really interested in using this is Lieutenant Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, and he, is able to convince them to bring it up to the Richmond area. The 7 days battle is going on, and this is during that Peninsula campaign that I talked about before. So he's eager to take a stab at, flying a balloon. So he likes the idea that the Yankees have developed of launching them from boats. So he gets permission to use or to take off from the deck of a Confederate ship called the Teaser. So in early July of 1862, he takes off. He's able to observe the enemy. He lands. But a few days later, on July 4th, ironically enough, he takes off, and it's a disaster. Because as soon as he takes off, the Teaser, the ship that he's taken off of, is tracked down by a couple of Union ships, including the USN Monitor, famed ship of the battle between the Monitor and the Virginia, or often known as the Monitor and the Merrimack, and another Union gunboat. And the Confederates just, abandon the tugboat because it gets grounded, which is bad luck for the Gazelle that's just kind of stranded there. So Porter is able to kind of roughly land it, and he has to abandon the balloon. So the Union captures both the tugboat and the balloon. So the Union Army says, well, gee, maybe this balloon can be of use to our balloon corps. So they deliver it up to Poolesville and give it to Lowe to inspect. And Lowe says, this thing is garbage, I'm not going to use it. So what he does instead is he cuts it up into little strips and he gives it as souvenirs to members of Congress as a way of, winning favor with them for continued funding for the Balloon Corps. So every congressman gets a little piece of the Gazelle. Next slide, please. So fortunately for the Union Balloon Corps, it will last a little longer, or quite a bit longer than the Confederate one does. It was used extensively in 1863 during the Fredericksburg campaign. And also in Chancellorsville, and the Union commanders at the time thought it was very useful and very helpful. But the problem is, again, it's never formally part of the Union Army. So the attitude of the Union Army toward the Balloon Corps depends on who the Union commander is. So with General McClellan, George McClellan, he really liked the Balloon Corps. General Hooker also liked the Balloon Corps, but some of the later generals didn't really like it and even resented it. So there are some problems that develop that lead to the end of the Balloon Corps, and they start to happen during the course of 1863. One is the rivalry between Lowe and LaMontagne reaches kind of a breaking point, and McClellan grows sick of it, and he sides with Lowe, so he pretty much dismisses LaMontagne, so he's out of the Balloon Corps. And then Lowe himself becomes more and more disenchanted because he's not getting the support or funding from either Congress or the Army. The balloonists themselves are disillusioned. Again, they're not considered to be members of the Army, so if they get shot down in enemy territory, they could be considered as spies and they could be shot because they're not wearing uniforms. So as 1863 wore on, Lowe eventually resigns from his position on the Balloon Corps, and a couple of brothers, Ezra and James Allen, would continue to keep the Balloon Corps going, but finally it just sort of petered out by the end of 1863. So, one might say, well, what did it accomplish? And I would say it accomplished quite a bit. Despite being phased out by the end of 1863, the Union Balloon Corps conducted over 3,000 successful missions throughout the Civil War. No balloon was ever shot down, and no aeronaut was killed or captured by the enemy. That's incredible. Through its innovative use of telegraphic and other airborne forms of signaling, it enabled, for the first time in history, communication of aerial surveillance information to military commanders in real time. Under the direction of General John Hooker, aerial reconnaissance experts were formally incorporated into the Army's comprehensive intelligence battle assessments, setting the precedent for the inclusion of such aerial reconnaissance data in future conflicts. The Union Balloon Corps observations greatly aided Union Army's topographical engineers in the development of sorely needed accurate maps. That was one of the biggest problems commanders on both sides of the Civil War had. There were not a lot of accurate maps in the lands that they were fighting. So the fact that for the first time you could have somebody go up and reliably tell you where the roads were, where the rivers were, big, big advancement. The observations by the Union Balloon Corps were highly valued by many Union commanders like General McClellan, who relied upon its reports before, during, and after battles. The problem with McClellan is he would take their observations and sometimes misinterpret them. And finally, the Union Balloon Corps also conducted the first aerial directional support for naval gunships, the incident I mentioned before at island number 10. Next slide, please. So I think the highest praise for the Balloon Corps actually came from the enemy. Many Confederate commanders like Lieutenant General James Longstreet expressed their envy for the Union's ability to field a balloon corps and kind of scratched their heads as to why it was discontinued. One Confederate artillery chief expressed this view after the war. I've never understood why the enemy abandoned the use of military balloons in 1863 after having used them extensively up to that time. Even if the observers never saw anything, they would have been worth all they cost for the annoyance and delay they caused us in trying to keep our movement out of their sight. So, next slide, please. So here you see all the distinguished people of the war and the age that were passengers aboard the Union Balloon Corps vessels. George McClellan, General Joe Hooker, General John Reynolds, Dan Sickles, and George Custer, who might have made use of a balloon corps at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Next slide, please. Okay, and then there's another notable passenger, a guy, oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm right. I skipped, yeah, hold on. If you can go back one, please. Okay. Oh, go for it, I'm sorry. And then there's this. It's also the first time that modern aircraft carrier task force are created. This would set the stage for the development and foundation of carrier task forces, not only for the United States Navy, which is still the premier one, but for other navies as well. Next slide, please. But I was about to say there's another notable passenger that was aboard these balloons, and that's this gentleman, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. He comes as a young officer from an area we now call Germany, as a cavalry officer to observe the cavalry operations of the Union Army. He doesn't really know anything about balloons, but while in St. Paul, Minnesota, he receives his first balloon ride from John Steiner, the guy that was at island number 10. And he is just smitten with balloons from that point on. All he can think about is balloons. And he will go on and credit that first flight with sparking his enthusiasm for the idea of lighter than air ships that are powered and that can be used for civilian and military potential. His, what we call today, Zeppelins, were powered, steerable, dirigible balloons that would add a whole new dimension to manned flight. They would not only be used for travel, but as you could see from the slide of the Zeppelin raid over England in World War I, they could be used to strategically bomb enemy targets. So that's his contribution. Now, during World War I, we didn't make much use of balloons. We had a few observation balloons on the coast, looking for subs and that sort of thing. But during World War I, we didn't use them. But after noting how the Germans used them, we decided we would try the same thing. And indeed, as part of war reparations, we took a few of their balloons and we developed these very big ones. These were filled with helium, far safer gas to use, by the way. And we created rigid airships like the USS Shenandoah, which is the first aircraft to ever cross the United States without stopping. The largest of these ships included the USS Macon and Akron. These were actually floating aircraft carriers. They could house, launch, and capture powered aircraft. Unfortunately, most of these airships crashed or had disasters, and with a heavy loss of life. So by the end of the 1930s, the use of these rigid airships ended. But that didn't mean that balloons ended. Next slide, please. And this slide just gives you an idea. This is one of these airships actually landing on an aircraft carrier. So you can see the perspective how big these ships were. Okay. All right, so during World War II, we don't give up the idea of using balloons. We just don't go with rigid balloons and large balloons. We go for smaller balloons. And they are developed by the Goodyear Company. If they look familiar, these are kind of what we see today. And these are used, these ships are smaller ships. They have crews of about 12. They carry a 50 caliber machine gun and some depth charges. And throughout the war, what they're doing is they're not only going along the coast, but most of these are accompanying convoys going across the Atlantic, looking for submarines and trying to protect them and just, make things safer. Now, after the war, they're used for a variety of things. They're used for photography missions, search and rescue missions, but they're phased out of use by August of 1962. So at that point, I could tell you that balloons are going to end, but of course, in the last few years, they've come into us, perhaps from other places. So the balloon has still not left us. It's still with us and probably will stay with us for quite some time. So next slide, please. These are some of the sources I use for this presentation. Next slide, please. This is my email address if you care to contact me. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to do the optical illusion. I'm going to pass these around. These glasses. This is a picture that was taken during the Civil War, and as was the practice, it was one of those stereo optical pictures, and I'm hoping that if you look at through these glasses, you'll get a 3D effect. Are you getting a 3D effect? Okay. I didn't tell you it would be as successful. Any 3D effect?
So you can see
Like
a
in the
little bit of depth.
thing? Okay, yeah.
There's a balloon behind the tree.
Ye-
Yes, is that what it is?
No, the guys like in the front holding the tow line should be in the front. Is anyone seeing it?
Yes, I see the basket.
Okay, I should mention you have to take hallucinogenic drugs to see it. Okay. Okay, so while you're doing that, this is a point where I say thank you very much for coming, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'll try to give you even a somewhat accurate answer. Yes, sir.
There was a bunch of forts around the DC area, from Stevens all the way around.
Right.
Did they use the balloon, and could have centered a balloon up, in the center of DC and just had it helping the fort?
That is an excellent question. There is a national park ranger by the name of Stephen Phan. His last name is Phan, and he used to be the director for the Forts of Washington thing, and he could probably answer that. I am not aware in anything I've read that they were used for the Forts of Washington, but I'm not saying that they weren't. Lowe's real desire was to get out where the action is, get out where the battles were happening. So, but at any given time, there may have been an extra balloon to spare to use for the defenses of Washington. The only time they were ever really threatened was during the Battle of Fort Stevens, and by that was after the Balloon Corps had,
Oh, that's true.
yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any documentation of where in Poolsville this was housed? Is there a site?
Well, there is that sign that I showed, and probably if you went through the documentation, you could probably find a site. I was never able to precisely locate it, but there are all sorts of references to Poolsville.
That's down by Edwards Ferry.
Edwards Ferry?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that it was at Edwards Ferry.
From Edwards Ferry, just too many trees in front of it.
Right.
They weren't there. They weren't there.
So that's where it's documented, but whether it was actually located there, I honestly don't know. There may be some local historians that could say, yes, it was located here, but I don't honestly know. Yes.
I've heard that they also, the Union Army also launched balloons off Sugarloaf Mountain.
That makes more sense.
That may be true. I didn't come across that in my thing, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And they were used during that period, and McClellan was a big balloon fanatic, so since he was the commanding Union officer, it entirely is possible. Yes, sir.
I was down at Edwards Ferry 10 years ago,
Mhm.
guessing at it, and they were launching a big balloon
Mm-hmm.
at the ferry,
Mm-hmm.
had a pulley system on the ramp,
Yeah.
and they put this thing up, I don't know, a couple of 100 feet, maybe more, I don't know. But it was something about commemoration of the first flight, but that was right on the boat ramp at
Right.
Edwards Ferry.
And when, I think it was 2015, they had a reenactment, Poolsville History Day thing, and a historian who, reenacts Thaddeus Lowe, he dresses like he brought a basket. They didn't bring the balloon, but that was, and he talked about, how much he loved Poolsville and everything. Now, what's interesting, after the war, Thaddeus Lowe went to California, and again, he had not a lot of formal education, but he was a brilliant guy, and he made a fortune in kind of like cooling systems, like ice and that sort of thing, and he built a fabulous house in California and stuff like that. So he was one of these like uneducated geniuses that just could develop it. Yeah, he was an inventor of all sorts of things. Anyone else? You look like you have a question. Yeah. Can you get a refund? No. No.
Well, it's just, because I've just heard of them using these balloons for reconnaissance during the Civil War, but it's like people, they kind of don't really mention Poolsville when they reference that. Do you think it's because people focus more on where they were going with the balloons opposed to where the balloons?
Yeah, I think so. But if you read his personal accounts, he may talk a lot about. I didn't get that much into it, but I think part of the problem is people just don't know about the Balloon Corps to begin with. So it hasn't led a lot of historians to kind of dig deeper as to Poolsville's key role in the Balloon Corps. So, yes, ma'am.
It surprises me that none of them crashed and no one died. Did the Confederacy attempt?
Oh yeah, they gave great. Yeah, they figured out that the best time to try to hit these balloons is when they're initially launched or when they're coming in. They tried to aim their artillery guns and everything. No, it wasn't for lack of trying that, the Confederacy tried every which way to destroy, capture, balloons, but they never succeeded, which I think is amazing, quite frankly. Yes, ma'am.
Did the balloon come to Poolsville because the telegraph was already here? Was there a telegraph that
I think,
went right to the White House?
from all the sources I get, a combination of things. They wanted to be near enough to Washington, but not too near Washington. There, I gather there was telegraph communication here. It's also fairly accessible to water. So there may have been a number of reasons that they picked Poolesville. I'm just glad they did.
Southern town had nothing to do with it, huh?
Well, there was a bit of an occupation force here, so yeah, that helped, yes.
Rick, I want to thank you so much.
Oh,
for
sure.
the